Yeah. And now we're thrilled to be joined today by historian Zachary Foster. Zach holds an undergrad degree from the University of Michigan in sociology and political science, a master's degree in Arab studies from Georgetown University, and a PhD in Near Eastern Studies from Princeton University. He's a fellow at the Rutgers Center for Security, Race, and Rights, and his work has been published in the Jerusalem Quarterly Journal, the Journal of Middle Eastern Studies, Foreign Affairs, and airs among other publications. Zach is the founder of Palestine Nexus, a newsletter highlighting important current events and history about the political and social forces that oppress Palestinians. Today, he will help. It's very good. Everybody should subscribe to the newsletter. Today, he will help us dissect Zionist propaganda that is being used to justify and obfuscate the ongoing genocide in Gaza and the last 75 years of dehumanization and occupation. Please join me in welcoming Zach Foster.
Thank you so much for that introduction. So, my presentation today is going to be a little bit all over the place because I do want to focus on what I perceive to be some of the most salient talking points that you will hear from genocide apologists and supporters of the State of Israel. So I apologize if we are jumping around a bit historically, different time periods, different aggressions, but I think that's important to do to cover some of the most salient talking points. So I've tried to summarize what I think are 5 key issues that relate to this one myth, this one piece of propaganda that I'm sure you've all heard. And in fact, as I was just scrolling through my email just a minute ago, literally the subject line of the email from the Friends of the IDF. I love following all of the Israeli propaganda outlets because it really does give you a great sense into what genocide apologists are saying. So this was the subject line of the email: Israel, the most moral army in the world. I'm sure you've all heard that. So let's talk a little bit about what makes an army ethical and what makes an army unethical. So there are 5 key violations here that I'd like to talk about in a little bit more depth and detail. So the first is collective punishment. Israel has openly rejected this principle for decades by its own admission and has been violating this principle for decades. Principle of distinction, which is an important principle in international humanitarian law that requires an army to distinguish between civilian targets and military targets. Israel has also openly rejected this principle for decades and has been violating it for decades. The principle of proportionality, again, the military target has, when you're carrying out, in a war, in an armed conflict, you need to abide by this principle, which is that the value of the military target has to be proportional to the civilian loss. And Israel has openly rejected this principle and has been violating this principle for many, many decades. Apartheid is actually a crime against humanity in international humanitarian law. And the Israeli army is an apartheid army. It enforces 2 regimes between the river and the sea, one for Israelis and one for Palestinians. We're going to get into more detail in the subsequent slides. And then most recently, the crime of genocide, which is outlined in the Genocide Convention of 1948 and the Rome Statute, I believe, of 1998, which now Israel is also in violation of that. So we're going to get into those details in the subsequent slides. So let's start with collective punishment. So I want to start this story in 1991, which is when I think Israel's policy of collective punishment really went into high gear. So recall that from Israel occupied Gaza and the West Bank in 1967, and from 1967 until 1991. Israel actually encouraged Palestinians in the occupied territories to work inside Israel or inside the Israeli settlements in the occupied territories. And then what happened was, in part because it wanted to create, it wanted Palestinians to be dependent on the Israeli labor market for work. And then what happened in 1991 was Israel began to deny Palestinians work permits and then began to require that Palestinians obtain an individual work permit to work in Israel. And so literally overnight, 40% of the people of Gaza, their livelihoods were threatened. In the West Bank, it was 30%. So, and then what you saw in the 1990s was that Israel began to impose lockdowns. They began to, in the Israeli terminology, it was called a closure, in which the Israeli military would surround a Palestinian town or village or refugee camp and prevent anyone from entering or exiting. And they began to do that really in the mid-90s. It got so bad that in 1996, the World Food Program actually engaged in an emergency food operation to deliver food to people who were going hungry in Gaza. 10,000 families were going hungry in 1996 as a result of the Israeli closure policy. And things subsided a bit in the late 90s, but then again in 2000s it got much, much worse when Israel brought back its policy of collective punishment, of locking down everyone, all Palestinians in the occupied territories, millions and millions of people who were dependent on, they needed to move, to go to work, to go to school, to go to a hospital, and the Israeli army prevented them from doing that. And so again, in the early 2000s, between 2002 and 2003, the number of people going hungry in Gaza was not 10,000, but it was in the hundreds of thousands. This is 2002, so we're talking more than 20 years ago. There are Palestinians going hungry in Gaza. And so the World Food Program initiates emergency food aid to something like, I think it was a couple 100,000 families in Gaza. And then, of course, what happened after 2005, when the Israeli army withdrew its 6,000 illegal Israeli settlers in Gaza in the disengagement plan, Israel began to basically impose not collective punishment for periods of days or weeks or months, but indefinitely. And so what it began to do in Gaza was really beginning in 2005, and then the policy accelerated in 2007, was Israel began to basically just lock down all of Gaza, right? So the policy of closure was extended to the entire population. All 2 million people living in Gaza were now being locked down and prevented from leaving the Gaza Strip for any reason at all. And that policy really went into high gear after Hamas won free and fair elections in January 2006 and took power in Gaza in June 2007. The policy of this policy of collective punishment went into high gear, and Israel basically completely locked down Gaza. And you've heard these numbers, I'm sure, many times, but after 16 years of this blockade, 80% of households in Gaza, this is on the eve of October 7th, 80% of households in Gaza were dependent on food handouts. 50% unemployment rate. Youth unemployment rate was actually 75%. So you guys are probably looking for jobs if you're graduating. Imagine 75% of you not being able to find one. And then the other 25% being paid very menial, finding very menial jobs. So that was Israel's policy of collective punishment, which obviously continues in the current genocide that we are witnessing in real time, and we'll get into greater detail on the genocide slide on that. Another thing that Israel does with regard to collective punishment is that it is mass arrests. So this policy dates back to the 1970s. In 1976, Israel arrested 32,000 Palestinians. In the end, it only actually detained 8,000 of them. But because of owing to its policy of indiscriminate mass arrest, anyone for any reason who's a male above the age of 15, we will arrest, right? So that policy dates back many, many decades. Now let's talk a bit about the principle of distinction. So as we said, you're obliged under international humanitarian law to target military targets. And we don't have to go all the way back. I mean, we could go all the way back to 48, or we could go back to the 60s and 70s. But let's focus on the past 16 years. In the 2008-2009 aggression on Gaza, this is a war that lasted about 3-4 weeks, in which Israel killed about 1,000 Palestinians. There was a report that was conducted by the UN in the aftermath of that war. It was called the Goldstone Report. Maybe some of you are familiar with it. That Goldstone Report found that it investigated, there were obviously hundreds and hundreds of strikes on Gaza. And what these UN officials do is they go and they try and investigate individual strikes and determine, was there any military target? What was the target? What was Israel trying to bomb? And they investigated 11 strikes that resulted in the deaths of something like 250 innocent civilians. And they found that in 10 of the 11 strikes, there were no military targets identified. And that led them to conclude that the goal of the operation, and I'm using their language now, was to terrorize the civilian population of Gaza. That was the stated goal of that was the unstated goal of the operation, according to that UN report. 2012, same thing. You had 60% of the people who died in that conflict, who died in that aggression, were innocent civilians. 2014 was the longest and deadliest of all the aggressions on Gaza, obviously up until 2023. In that war, Israel killed 1,500 innocent Palestinian civilians in Gaza, 550 of whom were children. And again, they do the same thing. They investigated 14 strikes in Gaza, 6 of the 14. So 40% roughly of the people killed on Gaza. There was no attempt, there was no military target identified. In other words, Israel was indiscriminately targeting innocent civilians in the 2014 war. In 2018-19, the Gaza March of Return protests, perhaps you're familiar with these. You had, beginning in March 2018, you had thousands, tens of thousands of Gazans, of Palestinians in Gaza, marching to the wall that separates Israel and Gaza every week, for weeks and weeks and weeks. And from March 2018 until May 2018, Israel gunned down and slaughtered a few dozen Palestinians. They're all unarmed. They have nothing to do with Hamas or Islamic Jihad. These are, it was described by many people at the time as a kind of Gandhian-like march, where you had tens of thousands of people waving flags, protesting the blockade, the siege on Gaza, demanding the right of return. And then on one day alone, on May 14th, 2018, Israeli snipers gunned down 60 Palestinians on a single day, on the same day that you had United States government officials in Jerusalem celebrating the move of the United States Embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, thus recognizing Israel's illegal annexation of Jerusalem. On the same day that Israel is slaughtering 60 unarmed Palestinian protesters, demanding an end to the siege and the blockade that was suffocating their life. So that was 2018-19. Then you had the 2021 war, in which I believe the Human Rights Watch report came out with, I think the statistic was around 75% of the strikes in the 2021 war. Again, no military target was identified. So long before 2023, the policy of the Israeli government was to target civilians. And so when someone tells you most moral army in the world, but Israel, Hamas targets civilians, well, the Israeli army tries to avoid civilian casualties. Well, that's just propaganda. That's a myth. And every single Human Rights Watch report, every single Amnesty report, every UN report over the past 16 years has debunked that myth. Let's also talk a bit about the genocide, which we'll get into greater detail in the subsequent slides, but I want to talk specifically about the genocide as it relates to collective punishment and the principle of distinction. So you've seen the reports. I'm sure you're all following. If you've decided to spend your free time on a Friday coming out to an event like this, you're following the situation on the ground. But let's just review some of the most salient points that relate to collective punishment and the violation of the principle of distinction. So the Human Rights Watch came out with a report already, I think it was in December, that Israel was using starvation as a weapon of war. And since then, in January and February and March, there have been 14 documented attacks on convoys delivering aid, delivering food, delivering water, delivering medicine. We all saw the most recent attack in which 7 foreigners were killed, and you see the shift in the Biden administration because it's white people dying rather than Palestinians dying. But 14 strikes, 198 humanitarian workers have been slaughtered by the Israeli army since October 7th. That is the most number of humanitarian aid workers slaughtered in any conflict in recorded history. We've never seen anything like this before. So when you're talking about principle, and these are people delivering aid. So Israel is intentionally starving not hundreds of thousands of people, but millions of people. That is collective punishment. That is a violation of international humanitarian law. Another interesting fact that was reported by CNN actually in December was that 45% of the bombs being dropped on Gaza right now are called basically dumb bombs. They're imprecise bombs, which can land up to 100 feet from their target. Again, half of the bombs being dropped on Gaza are dumb bombs, which by design kill innocent civilians. And then there was a recent, there was some reporting that came out by Plus 972, which is an Israeli publication, a kind of a Palestinian Israeli publication, and by a guy named Yuval Abrams, I believe is his name. It just came out 2 days ago. I don't know if you guys have seen this report. It's an 8,000-page expose Incredible reporting. He's sourcing from Israeli soldiers. He just did an interview with Amy Goodman this morning on Democracy Now, an incredible news source. If you don't follow Democracy Now, but they do daily. It's an hour report every day. They did an hour interview with Yuval Abrams, and he talks about his sourcing, and what he found was that according to Israeli sources who are in charge of the policy with regards to bombing Gaza, they are willing for a low-level military target, so basically any one of the 40,000 Hamas fighters, or anyone even associated with Hamas in any capacity, could be a police officer, could be a family member of a Hamas civil servant, so basically anyone who has any connection to Hamas, they're willing to target, they're willing to accept a casualty count of between 15 and 20 innocent civilians when they're targeting a low-level Hamas associate. 15 to 20. That is the ratio that they according to these Israeli military sources. When it comes to a high-level target, could be a commander, 300 to 500. Those were the numbers that came out just as of reporting as of 2 days ago. And obviously, 70% of the housing stock, according to a Wall Street Journal a Wall Street Journal article, 70% of the housing stock of Gaza has been either partially or completely destroyed. You have an IDF source that said, quote, "We could have destroyed 10% of what we destroyed." You obviously have it's hard to even keep track of how many videos we've seen of the Israeli army targeting unarmed civilians, just literally walking along the beach, walking in an open field. They're unarmed, they're not carrying weapons, they're slaughtered. And now we have reporting on the reason for that. Because they're probably located in these quote-unquote kill zones, where you literally have large swaths of the Gaza Strip, where anyone who enters these areas is automatically killed. So for an army that claims to be the most moral army in the world, we're talking about an incredible level, an incredible amount of violations in terms of collective punishment and the laws of the principle of distinction. Let's talk about proportionality. I guess we've already kind of touched on that with the point I just made about the ratios of acceptable death counts of innocent Palestinians. As we said, 20 when it's a low-level official, a low-level associate, 300 to 500 for a high-value target. We talked a bit about the 2008 to 2021 aggressions on Gaza, but we didn't talk about the ratios. So in the 2008 to 2009 aggression, Israel killed 1,400 Palestinians in Gaza. And Hamas also fires rockets in Israel, which is also a war crime. And so you had in that aggression, you had 3 Israeli civilians killed. So what's that, like 500 to 1 is the ratio? So when you're thinking about the principle of proportionality, we can debate on the margins. What is a proportional attack? But 500 to 1, I think, would be considered disproportionate by any definition, by any standard. 2012, Israel killed 171 Gazans, about 60% of whom were civilians, and then Palestinian militants killed 4 Israeli civilians. So we're talking about a ratio of, what's that, 50 to 1, 40 to 1. Israel, in the 2014 aggression, Israel killed 1,500 Palestinian civilians in Gaza, and Palestinian militants killed 6 Israeli civilians. In the 2018 to 2019 aggression, the Gaza March, protests, 223 Palestinians were killed, and 6,000 were left with life-changing wounds. Israel suffered 0 casualties, right? So no Israeli, be that military or civilian, was harmed at all. So that's like, I guess, infinity, because you're dividing by 0. In the 2021 aggression, Israel killed 261 Palestinians in Gaza, and Palestinians killed 14 Israelis. And then in the most recent descent into madness, the numbers were first 1,400 Israelis killed, and then it was reduced to 1,200. 764 of whom were civilians. But even among those 700, and then however many Palestinians, and how many Palestinians have been killed, I think the account right now is 33,000, but I think that's obviously a gross underestimate because we don't know how many people are under the rubble. In fact, we know many thousands are under the rubble. Those are just confirmed. And even among the 764 Israeli civilians, we actually don't know how many of them were killed by Israel itself. Because in the chaotic events of October 7th themselves, you had multiple accounts. We don't know the exact numbers. I think that the best guess is dozens. Probably dozens of Israeli civilians were killed by the Israeli military during the attacks of October 7th. So maybe you're talking over 700 Israeli civilians massacred by Hamas and other Palestinian armed groups on October 7th, as compared to probably something like 40 to 50,000 already killed, and if you by Israel. And I think the estimates will be dramatically higher in the months and years to come, because there was a report that was published about a month ago. There were a bunch of health researchers based out of the UK, and I can't remember where. They published this 55-page report, and they basically said, look, if the violence ends now, if there's a ceasefire, and then they published this report, it's been already a month or two, and they said if the violence ends today, we expect another 8,000 Palestinians to die in the next couple of weeks and months, owing to the destruction of the healthcare system, the spread of diseases, the fact that people who have wounds can't get care, the fact that there's ongoing starvation and famine. So that was that was the assumed number of Palestinians who would die, assuming there was a ceasefire when they published the report, which I think was March, somewhere in mid-March. But of course, there hasn't been a ceasefire. Israel still is slaughtering, on average, anywhere between 50 and 150 Palestinians every day in the past month. So the violence has continued. The attacks on the hospitals have continued. And so I think their estimate was, if there is no ceasefire, there would probably be, if the violence continued, there would be probably 50,000 excess deaths. Those are deaths not associated with direct aerial bombardment, or not associated with basically people dying from the bombs themselves, but all of those second order effects, like starvation, like wounds, festering wounds, like diseases, etc. And if we go back before the aggressions on Gaza from 2008 to 2021, the principle of proportionality has been violated in almost every single conflict, you could say, or spot of violence. So going back to the first Intifada, from late 1987, do you guys know the context for the first Intifada, the first uprising? So basically, you had Israel occupied Gaza and the West Bank in 1967. For the first 20 years of Israel's military occupation of those territories, Israel was killing, on average, 32 Palestinians every year for 20 years. Israel was denying Palestinians basic political rights, the right to organize, the right to vote. Obviously, you're an occupied person, you cannot vote for the government that controls your life. They were controlling the Palestinian economy. They introduced a permit regime. You had to get a permit to do anything. It was illegal to wave a Palestinian flag. It was illegal to use the word Palestine in the name of a bank or a society or an institution. It was illegal to paint a painting using red, black, green, and white, which is why, by the way, the watermelon became a Palestinian symbol. Because I'm painting a painting of a watermelon. But that's illegal now as well? So that was Israeli occupation for 20 years. And obviously that led to a revolt, that led to an uprising. And that was the first Intifada, right? It was Palestinians feeling humiliated at checkpoints, feeling dehumanized in the workplace, being denied wages, cheated out of their wages. They were all they predominantly working inside Israel or in the Israeli settlements. And so they revolted. In the first year of that revolt, from late 1987 to 1988, the Israeli military entered Gaza, killed 142 Palestinians in Gaza, and suffered 0 casualties, because it was a non-violent revolt, primarily, right? It was Palestinians, boycotting Israeli rule, protesting, burning tires, kids throwing stones, and in that first year they suffered 0 casualties in Gaza. So again, and then over the course of the entire revolt, 1,200 Palestinian casualties, 160 Israeli casualties. So again, this principle of proportionality, Israel has been violating it for decades. Second Intifada, still, even the most, prior to 2023, this was the most violent period for Israelis in all of Israeli history, right? So Palestinian militants killed 1,000 Israeli civilians from 2000 to 2005. And that transformed Israeli society. Israelis became, the right wing has dominated Israeli politics and society since 2009 as a result of that, as a result of the Second Intifada. But at the same time, of course, even while Palestinians killed 1,000 Israelis, Israel killed 3,200 Palestinians. So even during the most violent period for Israeli civilians, Palestinians were still suffering at 3x the rate in terms of the death counts. So this is a principle that Israel has been violating for decades. Let's talk about Israeli apartheid. This is Apartheid Week. You have, the basic, what does apartheid mean, right? It means you have different legal regimes for different categories of people, right? And so in the state of Israel today, which extends between the river and the sea, so between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea, there is one government, there's one state. That is the state of Israel. There are no other states. There are, little kind of enclaves where you have some amount of self-rule, but they're not states. That would be Gaza, where you have some amount of rule from the inside. But obviously, Israel controls the borders, controls 6 of the 7 land borders in Gaza. It controls the airspace, controls the telecommunication network, controls the population registry, right? So Israel is in control of Gaza, even though there has been some amount of self-rule within Gaza for the past 16 years. Israel, it's still being militarily occupied by Israel. Same is obviously true in the West Bank, even though you have parts of the West Bank where you have some amount of Palestinian autonomy or self-rule. Obviously, the Israeli military enters all areas of the West Bank and Gaza whenever it wants, right? So that's how you know it's all being controlled by Israel. So there's one state. And the other way you know that is that there's only one prime minister, right? There's only one military. There's only one cabinet. There's only one parliament, right? It's all one government controlled by a single parliament and a single cabinet and a single prime minister and a single military, and it controls everything between the river and the sea. But between the river and the sea, there are different legal regimes. There is one for Israeli citizens. They vote for the government that controls their lives. There's a separate one for Palestinians. They do not vote. They do not have freedom of movement. There are different laws that apply to them. And I think it's important to be specific, just to give you a few examples of how this apartheid regime works. So I like to just screenshot these areas of the West Bank where you have these communities literally living side by side, just to illustrate how, in a very visceral way. So, for example, you have in the top, in the bottom screenshot, you have this is a screenshot in the West Bank, in Efrat. It's near Bethlehem, near Beit Lehem. This is an Israeli settlement. It's just across the road from Jurat Shamra. So you're literally talking about, a walking distance, two towns, one Jewish, one Palestinian. The Jews living in Efrat, the Israeli citizens living in Efrat, they were given 3G already in 2004. Palestinians, no, they're denied 3G. They don't have internet on their phones until 2018. Why? Well, because they're Palestinian. That's how it works. It's a different legal regime. Let's talk about Hebron. In Hebron, it's even more extreme. They're living not just on the same street, they're literally neighbors. So in the city of Hebron, which is actually the largest city in the West Bank, you have Palestinians and Israelis living side by side. Like I said, neighbors. If a Jew is arrested in Hebron, Israeli law requires they be brought before a judge within 24 hours. If a Palestinian in Hebron is arrested, Israeli law requires they be brought before a judge within 192 hours. Again, different legal regimes for different categories of human beings. Let's take the example of Jerusalem. So in Jerusalem, same story. In the old city of Jerusalem, you have a street called, you have a gate in the old city of Jerusalem called Bab Zahra, and that street, Zahra Street, again, it has Jews. I actually lived on that street for about 6 months. It has Jews and Palestinians living on the same street. If you are a Jew and you live on that street, you are given Israeli citizenship when you are born. But if you are a Palestinian and you live on that street, you are not given Israeli citizenship when you are born, and you will likely never get Israeli citizenship. Why? Well, because you're Palestinian. There aren't two reasons. There's one reason. It's because you're Palestinian. Let's talk about another area of the West Bank. Here you have I didn't take the screenshot, but you have again, same idea. There's a road called Road 357. It has Palestinians and Israelis. It's in the West Bank. It has Palestinians and Israelis both living on that street. An Israeli can organize a political protest without a permit. They can organize 10 people or 11 people for a political purpose without a permit. But if a Palestinian does that, they can be imprisoned for 10 years. Again, different legal regimes for different categories of human beings. Israelis are entitled to these rights. They will, they will go to a civilian court if they get arrested. Whereas Palestinians do not have rights. They can be arrested for 10 years for organizing 10 people for a political cause. So let's talk a bit about a genocide. This is not a slide that we would have really been talking about on October 6th, but here we are, 6 months later. Genocide means committing one of 5 acts with intent to destroy, in whole or part, a national, ethnic, excuse me for that typo, ethnic, racial, or religious group. Right. So the UN Special Rapporteur for the occupied Palestinian territories, her name is Francesca Albanese. She came out with a statement just a few weeks ago, basically saying that there are, quote, clear indications Israel has violated 3 of these acts, killing members of, again, with intent to destroy in whole or part members of the group. In whole or part this group. So killing members of the group, causing serious bodily harm or mental harm, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or part. So I think what we've heard most about the past 6 months, what we've heard international legal experts emphasize over and over and over again, is that this is a unique among genocides in the modern era. Because usually it's hard to prove intent, right? And that's really the key piece here, right? Because, without that piece, without the intent piece, it's not genocide. You have to have intent to destroy in part or in whole the group. And what we've seen since October 7th is not 1 or 2 or 3 statements from the most senior Israeli officials in charge of the policy on Gaza, but literally hundreds of statements. And of course, the International Criminal Court of Justice, in its January 27th decision, published those statements, so you can read them. They've collected them, they've published them. We're talking about the Israeli Prime Minister likening the people of Gaza to Amalek. Not once, but twice. This is the commander-in-chief of the army in charge of the policy in Gaza, who has said twice, the enemy is Amalek. And who is Amalek? It's the people that the biblical Israelites were ordered to wipe out completely, every man, woman, elderly person, and child. He ordered his army to carry out a genocide. You have the defense minister, Yoav Gallant, no food, no water, no medicine. He said that on October 9th. So the intent is clear. Moshe Katz was the transportation minister, said level Gaza, destroy everything. Every single senior Israeli official has made genocidal statements. So the intent is obvious, and then the acts are even more obvious. So it's not even really a debate anymore. You have the UN stating outright, there's clearly a genocide taking place. Okay, so that was myth 1, right? The most moral army, you cannot be the most moral army in the world if you are carrying out a genocide. Let's talk about human shields. This is another one of those talking points that gets repeated ad nauseum. It was repeated, I think, at least 4 times by President Joe Biden since October 7th. It has been repeated at least twice by Secretary of State Anthony Blinken. Hamas targets civilians while Israel, Israel, targets, military targets while Hamas hides behind human shields. So, I think one of the interesting things historically is that actually, if you really, look historically at the Zionist project, one of the most fundamental elements of building a Jewish state in a land that was majority non-Jewish was establishing civilian outposts in border areas. The project of Zionism was all about putting civilians in harm's way, was using civilians as human shields. That was very much underlying the policy of Israeli settlement in the years after 1948. So you had about 108 settlements. Settlements is probably the wrong word here, but let's just call them civilian population centers. 108 Israeli civilian population centers were built after 1948. Including, by the way, many of the towns that border Gaza, including many of the towns that were attacked on October 7th. They were built with the explicit purpose of serving as a first line of defense. And these were civilian population centers. So you might say that the use of human shields is really at the core of really the entire kind of policy, a settlement policy, housing construction policy of the state of Israel for the past 75 years. That's the first point I would make. I think the second point to make here is that Israeli settlers in particular, there are about 600,000 Israeli settlers living in the West Bank. They wear military garb, so they enmesh themselves with the Israeli military, whenever they're going and attacking Palestinians. So there is this incredible enmeshing, this incredible use, I would call it, of human shields between Israeli settlers and the Israeli military in the West Bank, and that has been an ongoing policy for many decades. In fact, many of the earliest Israeli settlements were actually first built as military outposts. That was how the Israeli military justified a lot of these settlements, right? Is that they would first establish, that's what they did in Hebron, for example. The first thing they did was they built a military outpost. They said, this is military, security. We're going to build an outpost, and then slowly start bringing civilians in. Let's build a home next to the outpost. Again, enmeshing the civilians as well together with the military. That was core to the policy of Israel's kind of settlement expansion policy over the past many decades. A third point to make here is that the IDF, the Israeli Defense Forces headquarters, is actually based in the heart of downtown Tel Aviv, right? So you've heard probably ad nauseum how many times, Hamas's headquarters is under Shifa Hospital. Well, that may or may not be true. We don't know where the Hamas headquarters is. But what we do know is that the Israeli Defense Forces headquarters is in the heart of downtown Tel Aviv. The final point I would make here is that over the course of the past many decades, you have dozens, if not hundreds, of documented cases of the Israeli military using Palestinians as human shields to protect themselves. You had an incredible report that came out, it was in the early 2000s, I think it was by ABC Australia, where you had, in Gaza in the early 2000s, you had the Israeli military literally establish an outpost on the rooftop of a Palestinian home. And then they required the Palestinians in the home to actually, there always had to be a Palestinian in the home at all times, for the purpose of making sure Palestinians didn't attack that home. Here I have a photo. There's photographic evidence, there's video evidence. Here you have an example. March 2018, Israeli soldiers detained Abdurrahim Reith in Jericho, ordered him out of the car, handcuffed him, made him sit on the road for 2 hours, used him as a human shield. And this has been an ongoing policy. The Israeli military, for example, in Jenin, what they'll often do is they want to enter a home to target militants. They'll grab a Palestinian to use as a human shield as they enter. And this policy, and like I said, I have a Twitter thread on it. We're literally talking dozens and dozens of documented cases. And again, that's very rare to find those types of cases among Palestinians. So I think, I'm not trying to argue that Hamas or other Palestinian groups do not use human shields. What I am trying to argue is that the narrative perpetrated by the United States government, from people like Biden, from people like Blinken, that it's that it's the Palestinians using human shields, I think the more accurate framing would be the opposite. Would be that actually it's Israel that consistently, over the course of many, many decades, has been using human shields over and over again. And so I think that is kind of how you address this argument. As I said, we're going to jump around a little bit. I don't know how much time I have left. Keep going. Okay. So one of the things you will hear all the time is that anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism. So what I want to do is actually talk a little bit, talk a bit of history here, because there has actually been, I think historically, you were more likely to be a Zionist if you were anti-Semitic than if you were not anti-Semitic. Let me say that again. Historically, it was more likely that if you were anti-Semitic, that you would be a Zionist. Let's talk about why. In 1878, you had a Hungarian politician named Stotsky. So he called for a Jewish state in Palestine in 1878. So this is really before Zionism exists. Christian Zionism preceded Jewish Zionism. This is not well appreciated. But there were many, many Christian Zionists calling for a Jewish state in Palestine in the 1830s and in the 1850s and the 1870s. Why? Well, because they were anti-Semitic, right? They wanted to rid Europe of the Jews. And in fact, this guy was the founder of the anti-Semitic movement in Hungary. He was a Hungarian politician. And he had Jewish blood on his hands. There were Jews that died because of him in Hungary. And he is calling for a Jewish state in Palestine. Why? Because he wants to get rid of the Jews. He wants them out of Hungary, right? So in 1881, the German journalist Wilhelm Marr, he actually popularized the term anti-Semitism. He also proposed sending all of world Jewry to Palestine. And his idea, Jews being these, in his view, they were the financiers, they controlled all the money, they had sickly bodies, they were diseased, all these grotesque anti-Semitic stereotypes about Jews, right? So he wanted to rid Europe of the Jews. Maybe he thought Palestine could become a Jewish penal colony. In 1898, you had the German emperor, so we're talking the third most powerful person in Europe at the time, maybe second most powerful, Kaiser Wilhelm II. He declared his support for Zionism. Why? First of all, he believed that the Jews killed Jesus Christ, so wouldn't it be great if they would stop exploiting Christians in Europe and just move to Palestine? But also, he believed that the Jews were the most powerful people in the world. And wouldn't it be great, and they controlled the money, and so wouldn't it be great if we were seen as the protector of this powerful regime in Palestine? Because then we would have influence in the Orient. We would have our own German influence would spread throughout the Orient because it would be our people, the Jews who were supporting this Jewish state. It would be our people who would be establishing a state in Palestine. So it was almost this this idea that if we're the ones seen as the protector of the Jews in the Middle East, in Palestine, then that will have second order benefits for us, for our empire, for our influence around the world. Again, based on this belief that Jews are powerful and that they can build this state in Palestine. And then, of course, the most famous Zionist, non-Jewish Zionist in history, Arthur Balfour, who was the Prime Minister of Great Britain before he was, this is 12 years before the Balfour Declaration. But in 1905, he's Prime Minister of Britain. He sponsors the Alien Act. Okay, do you know what the Alien Act was? It was legislation to keep Jews out of Great Britain. Jews who were fleeing pogroms in Eastern Europe. Jews are fleeing violence. They're being slaughtered in the Russian Empire. They're being slaughtered in Ukraine, in Odessa, in the thousands. They're fleeing. They're going to the United States. They're trying to go to Britain. In 1905, Arthur Balfour says, no, we don't want you. And then he becomes the most famous non-Jewish Zionist in history by sponsoring the Balfour Declaration that you've probably all heard of, which called for the establishment of a Jewish homeland in Palestine. And really became the basis for Britain's interwar policy of encouraging Jewish immigration to Palestine from 1922 to, let's say, 1918 to 1948. I also think it's worth talking a bit about kind of the underlying causes of violence here. I mentioned my focus is the late Ottoman period, so this is a topic that's near and dear to me. But when you think about kind of why are Jews and Palestinians killing each other? What is at the core of the violence? I think it's actually worth talking about that period really before there was violence and kind of trying to understand, what was life like before Zionism? So in Jerusalem, on the eve, let's say, of Zionist immigration to Palestine, so roughly from 1870 to 1914, Jews, in places like Jerusalem, you have Jews, Muslims, and Christians living on the same streets, shopping in the same stores, sharing residential courtyards together, where you have Jews and Muslims, children playing in the same courtyards. You have an anecdote from Amos Oz, who was a very famous Israeli novelist. His father shared with him an anecdote that he discusses in his memoir, where he says, my father told me stories. We would play with the Muslims, and us Jews and us Muslims in our courtyard would gang up and fight against other Jews and other Muslims from other streets and other neighborhoods. The fault lines were not, forget about Jew-Palestinian, they weren't even Jewish-Muslim. So there was a real sense of harmony between Jews, Muslims, and Christians on the eve of Zionist immigration. The same was true in Manshia, which was a neighborhood of Jaffa. The same was true in places like Tiberias and Safed, where you had Jews and Muslims living side by side. You have anecdotes of Muslims celebrating with Jews in Sheikh Jarrah, neighborhood of East Jerusalem right now, where you have violence between Jews and Palestinians. In the late 19th, early 20th century, they went on picnics together, where Muslims joined Jews to the tomb. They went to the tomb of Shimon HaTzadik, whose grave is buried in Sheikh Jarrah. They would have picnics together there. Now those picnics are Jewish settlers attacking Palestinians. Okay? They celebrated each other's holidays together. You had Jews celebrating Ramadan with Muslims. You had Jews and Muslims celebrating Easter together with Christians. There was a true sense of harmony. And then on top of all that, they all shared an Ottoman identity. They all had a common Ottoman citizenship, where Jews, Muslims, and Christians all believed in Ottomanism, this shared sense that we're all subjects of the Ottoman Empire. And we all believe in the Ottoman Constitution, that all of us have equal rights. But Zionism said, we don't all have equal rights. Zionism said, Jews, we're building a Jewish state, where Jews have certain privileges, which is going to guarantee Jewish development, and it's going to guarantee Jewish prosperity. And we're going to ensure Jewish safety. Well, guess what happens to Muslims and Christians in a world where Jews dominate? There is no more equality. And so my view here would be that really, if you really want to understand the core problem, why are Jews and Palestinians killing each other? It's this ideology that says Jewish rights, Jewish development, Jewish prosperity is supreme. And it's emboldened, enshrined in the concept of a Jewish state. I don't know how much time I have. Maybe I'll pause there. I have maybe a couple more slides, but maybe I'll pause there because I do know we want to open it up to Q&A as well. Thank you all for hanging around and for listening to the presentation, and maybe we'll open it up to Q&A. Sure. I don't know. Is this even on?
Awesome. Thank you so much, Zach. So I'm just going to ask maybe one pre-prepared question, and then we're going to turn it over to audience Q&A. So think of questions now. So you are a Jewish anti-Zionist, and you grew up surrounded by kind of Zionist thought and belief. So what was what turned you on to anti-Zionism, or what was the moment for you that made you realize that this kind of belief system that you were surrounded by was so flawed?
Thanks for that question. Yeah, I grew up in a very Jewish environment. That's exactly correct, very Zionist environment. And I think look, someone who grows up in an environment that I grew up in is not going to become an anti-Zionist overnight. It's a process. I think the first step along the way for me was actually just meeting Palestinians. Already, many of the myths are dispelled, right? Okay, wow, they're not all terrorists. Okay, that's interesting. I didn't know that, but they aren't. So that was one very important kind of light bulb moment. It's like, wow, these are human beings. I think the second light bulb moment for me was I traveled to the Balkans with a group of Jews and Palestinians, American Jews, American Palestinians, on a kind of comparative conflict analysis program. And actually, as an undergrad, I think the program is now defunct in case you're interested in doing it, but I think encountering Palestinian Americans and hearing their stories, them talking about their connection to Palestine, that their parents, their grandparents are from Palestine, that they have a longing for Palestine, they want to go visit, but they can't. Whereas me, an American Jew, who may not speak a word of Hebrew or Arabic, who may never have been there, who may not know anything about it, I can go there tomorrow and get citizenship tomorrow. Does that make sense? Here we are, two people, one has a very strong connection to the place, one has no connection to the place, but the person who has no connection, they're the one who has the right. And the person whose grandparents were born there and expelled by gunpoint, they don't. That was a light bulb moment as well. And then I think ultimately when you start reading the history, the more of Israeli history that you read, the more anti-Zionist you become. I mean, I'm a historian. As I'm sharing with you these slides, right? How can you not come to see that creating a Jewish state in a land that is 90% non-Jewish is going to create problems?
Yeah, awesome. Thank you so much. Kind of going off some of the stuff you were just saying, there's the common idea is that Israel is like the Jewish homeland and all Jews are indigenous and thus have the right to go there. How do you respond to these kind of claims, or what role do you think indigeneity plays in this discussion?
I tend to think more in terms of the law and kind of international law in particular. I do think that international law is an incredible human achievement. I think that over the course of many, many millennia, there really were no laws governing the rules of engagement between states, between empires, between fiefdoms, between city-states. was anything goes. You kill anyone for any reason, and there's no repercussions. There's no international humanitarian law. There's no rules at all. You slaughter whoever you want. You rape whoever you want. You kill whoever you want. And now we have international humanitarian law, and that law has things to say about things like refugees, about things like proportionality, distinction, collective punishment, all the things we talked about. So when someone says, "Oh, I have a right to claim Israeli citizenship because 3,000, 2,000 years ago, I have a belief. I can't really prove it to you, but I think some great 35 generations ago, lived there. So I have a right. But the person whose grandfather was born there and was expelled by gunpoint, they don't have a right? You want to talk about indigenous rights, but the person whose grandparent is from there doesn't have the right, but the person whose great-grandparents by 40 generations that may or may not have ever even been there, they have the right. So that makes no sense to me.
Totally. I'll ask one more question and then turn it over to the audience. What role do you think that the Israeli left could play in Palestinian liberation? And do you think that there even is a meaningful Israeli left in any capacity?
Well, there is an Israeli left. It's not very big. There was a poll conducted in January, just 2-3 months ago. I haven't seen more recent polling. There probably is, so if someone has more recent polling, feel free to speak up. But the poll found that 95% of Jewish Israelis believe that the Israeli army was either using the appropriate amount of force in Gaza or not enough force. So you could say that as of January, and again, there may be more recent polling, maybe those numbers have declined slightly, but you could say that as of January, 95% of Jewish Israelis were pro-genocide. Now, that means 5% were, you could say, let's say, critical of genocide. So, but 95%, I mean, what do 95% of Americans or Costa Ricans or Brazilians or Germans believe about anything? I mean, to get 95% consensus within a particular segment of a society is astounding. But yes, you do have, like I think I mentioned the publication 972. Yuval Abrams is a Jewish Israeli. He just won an award in Berlin for a film he co-directed with Bassem Adra, Palestinian from Masaf Farigata. And Israeli military sources are sharing details with him about how many innocent dead Palestinians are acceptable for every strike. Well, and he's publishing that, and that's being studied by every single major publication, every single news outlet in the entire world. So it's not to say there are. So you have 972. Obviously, you have B'Tselem. You have the Israeli civil societies, the Israeli human rights organizations like B'Tselem, like Breaking the Silence, like Al-Haq. Right, so there are Israeli, and then you have Israeli Palestinian society. These are Israeli civilians. Israeli citizens. 20% of Israeli citizens are Palestinian. And in my view, if the Israeli left has any hope of moving Israel from the inside, there has to be an alliance between Palestinians and the Jewish left. Because without an alliance, just imagine the United States Democratic Party divided in half. Would they ever win an election if you had three parties? The Republican Party. But obviously beyond allowing humanitarian aid and beyond the ceasefire, because you can't get humanitarian aid without a ceasefire, right? That's the other problem. So those are two sides of the same coin. The way you deliver aid is by stopping the bombs and dropping the bombs and allowing and agreeing to stop hostilities. So those two things need to happen immediately before you can talk about. I mean, but you're asking kind of longer term. Where's the light at the end of the tunnel? Look, I don't really care how many states there are between the river and the sea. I think what I care about are that however many states there are, that all people are equal in all of those states. Right? That's the way you prevent violence. Because when people have the right to vote, when people have freedom of movement, they don't resort to violence. They vote. And that's what happened in Ireland, that's what happened in South Africa. When they can express their views through the ballot box, they do not express their views with a gun or with a bomb. And that's just, I think, proven historically over and over and over and over again whenever you have these types of conflicts. So everyone has to be equal. There can be two states. There can be one. I mean, what do I think is possible? I think I don't think the two-state solution was. Look, you have 600,000 Israeli settlers living in the West Bank. Okay, there's 160 some odd Bantustans in the West Bank. There's no such thing as even if so to talk about a two-state solution really means to imagine that Israeli society was flipped on its head, right? It would be that instead of 95% of Israelis supporting the genocide, it would be 95% opposed, right? It would be like instead of the vast majority of Israelis basically supporting the settlement enterprise, it would be the vast majority now. You have to imagine a world that doesn't exist. So the world that we have is a world in which Israel is every day expanding settlement headcount, expanding number of settlements, annexing more land in the West Bank, destroying more Palestinian villages. They're every day, there are Israeli army officials going into the Mossad and destroying another home daily. It used to be weekly. Since October 7th, it's daily. Every single day, the Israeli army enters Jenin, destroys another home, kills another Palestinian or 10 Palestinians. Occupation, infrastructure, the roads are also expanding. They're building more Israeli-only roads. So in a world where the Israeli occupation infrastructure is continually expanding and slowly taking control over more and more of the West Bank, and now also Gaza, there's no hope for a two-state solution to the extent that there ever was one. That idea is dead. There's just no, and again, unless you want to live in a fantasy world that is disconnected from the world we live in which the Israeli right has been dominating Israeli politics, and now the Israeli right is even more powerful and has gained even more strength, and Israel has moved even more to the right. So the two-state solution was dead on October 6th, is dead times 100 on October 7th. Now there's no, so if Israel will never give up the territories and allow Palestinians a state, which it won't, which it hasn't, then what you're left with is one state, and that's why people call it a one-state reality. There is only one state. And the question is, what kind of state do we want? Do we want a state where everyone's equal, or do we want a state that has different legal categories for different types of people?
Thank you so much for the talk. And I had a question. How do you debunk people who usually compare this war to the war in Ukraine, and usually people we don't support Palestine because Russia supports Palestine, and Russia is killing Ukrainians, and the people who are super pro-Ukraine are also very pro-Israel because they don't want to support Russia, and Russia supports Palestine. So how do you kind of approach and respond to those points?
That's a good question. I think the parallels actually are closer between, the parallel I would draw would be Russia occupying and invading Ukraine, Israel occupying and invading Palestine. To me, that's the parallel, right? Because, since 2014, Russia has, so we're talking about more than a decade now, Russia has been occupying sovereign Ukrainian territory. Since 1967, we could go back even further, but let's just go back to 67, Israel has been occupying sovereign Palestinian territory. That's the parallel, right? So I don't, and then if you could draw the parallel even further, right? Russia has been indiscriminately targeting civilians in occupied Ukrainian territory. Russia, Israel is indiscriminately targeting civilians in occupied Palestinian territory. So that's the analogy I would draw. So I don't know why, we can debate all the reasons why some people are supporting certain sides, and that's up to them. But if you let's look at the two cases. You have illegal occupations. You have Russia illegal occupying Ukraine, Israel illegally occupying the Palestinian territory. So I think that's the better analogy.
Any more questions? Yes, sir.
I guess I've been lucky enough to experience this personally. But how do you counter the argument that a lot of people have that if you were gay or LGBTQ in Palestine, they would murder you, and I think it's an extension of the idea of being the most warm army in the world is that they're gay friendly, and
I think is that what it's called? Or sorry, maybe I'm getting the phrase wrong.
You still can't legally marry same-sex couple in Israel, even though it's promoted as very LGBTQ friendly. So that's not
Yeah.
That's all I have to say on the matter.
Well, look, if you want to talk about, if you're a Jew, you cannot marry a Muslim or a Christian in the state of Israel. Also, for a country that claims to be very progressive on marriage equality, why can't a Christian marry a Muslim?
Also,
That's a bit weird.
Also, questions about Palestinian and Ethiopian Jews in Israel and how they're treated, even though it's purported to be a state that is pro-Judaism towards. That would be interesting.
Yeah, that's a great point. I mean, you have an incredible amount of discrimination against black Jews in Israel. Not just black Jews, Eastern Jews, Mizrahi Jews. Look, I think this is sort of, it kind of comes back to this sort of broader problem, sort of whataboutism, right? Like, well, what about the Uyghurs in China, right? Well, what about what's happening in Ethiopia? And it's like, but we're talking about Israel's genocide in Gaza. We can talk about other problems in Palestinian society, of which there are many, and of which, by the way, Palestinians talk about all the time. But that is unrelated. It's just a whataboutism, right? It's not related to the topic. I can believe that Palestinians have a long way to go on LGBT rights at the same time that I can believe that Israel is carrying out a genocide in Gaza. Those are not mutually exclusive beliefs. There's just one has nothing to do with the other. It's like, okay, so you want to switch the topic is what you want to do. You want to deflect from the genocide is what you want to do. Right? Oh, why don't the Arab states do more? Well, again, what does that have to do with Israel's genocide in Gaza? You're just deflecting. You're just whataboutism.
Is there a question over here?
Just thank you for the talk, and I guess more on like a the macro discursive level from like outside of like Israel, especially in the political West. Like you said, like this whole lecture was about like Zionist myths and how a lot of times I think for most people, just from the United States, like these myths are almost assumed to be really accepted uncritically and almost like repeated sort of like just like without constantly. And I guess what do you think? I guess there's two parts. One is, do you think there is a shift beginning in I guess political consciousness from a broader level to be more like aware of the actual history of the Israel-Palestine conflict? And two, what do you think steps need to be taken to actually ensure that this sort of like correct history and sort of these myths are debunked?
Could you just say the first part again one more time?
Oh, do you think there is like since sort of like in the since this war, do you think there has been a change in sort of like mass public opinion and stuff on like these like myths?
Right, and then what can you do to change that, right? Okay, so, I mean, definitely there has been. Look, in the week or two after, maybe in the first few days after October 7th, it was the opposite, right? You had people who don't know anything about the Middle East at all, probably never even heard of Israel or Palestine, all of a sudden putting Israeli flags on their social media profiles, right? But very quickly, it didn't take long, but very quickly what happened was that the ferociousness and the brutality and the Palestinian civilian death toll already 1 week on was already higher. It took Israel 1 week to kill more Palestinians than Israeli casualties on October 7th. And so basically, ever since then, we've just been on a continual march towards, I think, more and more awareness. I think, I mean, not just, I think the numbers in the Democratic Party among Democrats, with the most recent polling data was 75% of Democrats are calling for a ceasefire, maybe 80%. You have mainstream U.S. Democratic politicians now talking about conditioning military aid to Israel. I'm not talking about the Squad, I'm not talking about Ilhan Omar, I'm not talking about Rashida Tlaib, I'm not talking about Cory Bush, I'm talking about mainstream, you have Chuck Schumer, the most pro-Israel human being in the Senate, calling out Netanyahu and basically calling him to resign. I mean, that would have been unthinkable even a few months ago. So you've seen a sea change, I think, in the U.S. political landscape. I think you've seen a sea change also internationally. You have Japanese firms cutting Itochu. You have multiple Japanese arms manufacturers cutting ties with Elbit, Israel's #1 military arms supplier. They said, we don't want to be in violation of this ICJ ruling. We are cutting our contracts with Elgin. This is something new. You've never seen this before. You have courts in Spain and the Netherlands asking the EU to investigate whether or not the European Union is now complicit in Israel's genocide in Gaza, and saying basically we need to investigate these arms deals we have with Israel. That's a first. We've never seen that before. You have a court in Oakland, California. You have a court just a month or two ago. It was on the same day as the ICJ hearing, actually, so it was already a few months ago. They basically said, look, there's a plausible case that there's a genocide, because you had a Palestinian family, I think, take Joe Biden to court and said, I forget who it was, but I have a relative who was killed, and I'm holding Joe Biden responsible because he is complicit in this genocide. And they took him to court, and it was an Oakland federal court, and the judge said, you're right, there is a plausible genocide taking place, but this is outside my jurisdiction. So you have courts, you have politicians, you have arms manufacturers. You see the actions taking place in the UK against the Elbit factories. The number of Palestine Action, which is an organization that basically organizes people to take direct action to shut down the factories that are shipping the weapons that are being used to kill Palestinians. They talk about how they've never seen more activists join their group. Massive rise in the number of activists. Look at the protests. You had 200,000 people show up in London the other day. We've never seen this level of protest numbers. So I think, look, I can take this. Let's be personal. I have a newsletter that was plugged. Thank you very much. I had people writing to me. Can I help? I started that newsletter in, was it June or July? Nobody was writing me in June, July, or September, or August. They were writing me in November and December. What can I do to help? There's people who want to do something. Our country is complicit in the genocide. So I think you're seeing a sea change, and I think it's only going to increase in the future. I think, just to the second part of the question, I think many countries will stop recognizing Israeli travel documents. I think Israeli leaders will not be able to travel abroad because they will fear arrest. Any country that's party to the ICC, they will fear arrest. I think the ICJ will not claim there's a plausible genocide. I think they will claim there is a genocide. So this is the beginning of the end of the state of Israel, as we've noted for the past 75 years.
So I think we have time for one or two more questions, maybe. Yes.
On like a smaller level, what actions do you think that we should be taking in order to get the end?
So, do you guys know, was it Smith College? It's just down the road, right? Yeah, we passed by on the way here. I was like, oh, Smith College, first college in the United States of America. I think this was just reported on yesterday or the day before, I think. You guys probably know this better than me. The first college, what was the headline?
Well, they're occupying the college building right now.
They're occupying the college building. They've what was it? Maybe was it study abroad programs? No, maybe not. But I can't. Maybe it was a different college, but there has been one university, I can't remember which one now, where the student was in California. It was in California, right? Where the students compelled the university to to divest from any, or basically, not divest is the wrong word, boycott Israeli academic institutions. We will not partner with these institutions. We will not sponsor study abroad programs in Israel. And that has actually been controversial in the past. Because you might say you're punishing individuals who may be, your best allies in Israel, you're punishing them. But now you have, no partnerships with Israeli universities. Divest from companies profiting off Israel's occupation and genocide. That's another thing. I don't know what the size of the Amherst College endowment is. But I can guarantee you that they have invested in companies that are profiting off the genocide. I can assure you of that. Because they're going to be in all kinds of index funds. So that you can take direct action. You can occupy the president's office. You can chain yourself around the president's office and say, we will not leave until you... And I'm not encouraging anyone to take personal risk to themselves. You all have futures ahead of yourselves that you should obviously, care about. But there obviously are direct things you can do on campus.
Keep your eyes open for future action. Anyone has a final question or anything? If not, that may be the end, but yes, great.
The thing you were saying before about seeing a change to the state of Israel as we know it, do you really think it's going to get to the point where Israel will be completely isolated from the global community as opposed to a de-escalation of the situation before it gets to that?
That's a great question. I mean, look, I'm not a fortune teller. I would be speculating just like anyone else, right? What I see happening right now inside Israel is very troubling. The society is in a process of I mean, it's in a process of self-destruction, and multiple layers. Not just because it's carrying out a genocide, but also for other reasons. You had just this week, there, you know, the ultra-Orthodox population in Israel does not serve in the military, and right now that is also and right now there's basically a law that is about to that looks like it probably will pass that will now require them to serve in the military. That's going to create a massive upheaval. Then you have the West Bank exploding. You have resistance everywhere. You have Hezbollah threatening. Now you have a spat with Iran. Israel killed, was it 10 people or 11 people in Damascus on Iranian sovereign soil this 3 days ago? I haven't even, maybe in the last hour a war has broken out between Israel and Iran. I mean, the number of ways in which Israel is kind of imploding all at once. I mean, it is very, and then on top of all that, the isolation. Now look, I think in the short term, as long as you have a US president that will support Israel, will send it as many bombs as it wants, will provide it as much diplomatic cover in the UN as it wants. I think in the short term, you know, it's hard to imagine the US really shifting course in any dramatic way in the next 4.5 years, right? Because we have this election, which is going to be Biden or Trump, and we're talking about, you know, 2 pro-genocide candidates. So I can't really see anything really changing in the next few years in the US. This is not something that happens overnight. I mean, look at how long it took South Africa, you know, South Africa's apartheid regime to fall. Those protests, you know, Princeton was the first university to divest, and that was in the 1970s. It was like 1977 or 78. When did the apartheid regime fall? Was it, you guys know, who's old enough to know? 91 or 2 or something, or 3? 94? They're talking 20 years. So these things take time. Social movements take time. The Civil Rights Act was what, 1965? George Floyd was 2020. That was 65 years later. So these things take time. Now, I'm not saying Israel is going to become an pariah state overnight, but that is certainly the direction it's headed in.
Okay, awesome. Thank you so much, Zach. And thank you so much to all of you for coming. Make sure to come to our final event for Israeli Apartheid Week this Sunday, 7 p.m. in CERN. And keep your eyes open. Follow us on Instagram, Amherst Palestine, if you aren't already. Keep your eyes open for future things, because there will be more. And thank you again.
Thank you for coming.